enter Elon Musk, right? This is what's different now. All right. So we just explained kind of one conservative approach was a little bit more reliant on the government. One conservative approach was a little bit more reliant on the free market and creating, competitive alternatives. Now we have this third option, right? Which is also within the free market option. And that is, if you don't like how a current company is running something, buy a portion of that company and start to have more influence on it. Now, there's a lot of people who say, well, okay, well, that's not fair. I can't buy, billions of dollars worth of Twitter. No, you can't, but Elon Musk can. And just like liberals come in and buy up significant portions of companies in order to push it in a particular direction, people that are conservative, or in this case, someone that's just more of a free speech advocate, can come in and see an economic opportunity by changing the way that Twitter works so it appeals to a much larger group. Because right now, Twitter, while it's still a platform that a lot of people operate on, it appeals and its rules are arranged in such a way as to benefit the left. And Elon Musk sees this as an opportunity to spread that out, gain more people doing it, and he can make more money, right? He can make Twitter more profitable by opening it up to a larger consumer base. Right? That is typically how people become super wealthy, right? There's this idea that you become super wealthy by designing something that's super expensive. Actually, you become super wealthy in a free market by providing something affordable that can appeal to as many consumers as possible. And so I think some of the changes that you're seeing Elon Musk potentially pushing within Twitter could actually create that environment where it becomes more profitable at the same time that it becomes more open to diversity with respect to its opinions and more consistency with respect to what its community guidelines say and how they enforce it. Now, here's another area that not a lot of people are talking about, right? But this is something that could be significant. And it's not just about changing Twitter to be more open. It's also about someone like Elon Musk or a majority of the shareholders being led by someone like Elon Musk, opening up what has gone on in the past with Twitter with respect to their algorithm and how they've been conducting themselves, right? Because we all got the company line from people like Jack Dorsey, right? But what was really going on? And now we might be in a position to find out more about how that algorithm is really working and how the inner workings of Twitter are really being used. Now, you always have to be ready to have information come back and learn that, okay, maybe things weren't as bad as you thought it was, or maybe things were a whole lot worse than you thought it was. But either way, it would be great to be in a position where we have someone that could impose that sort of transparency within an organization so that we can confirm or deny a lot of the claims that have been made. And I think a lot of the activity that most of us identify as being specifically directed toward the selective application of the rules to target conservatives to the benefit of their left-wing, participants or the left-wing owners, right? That's something that could be critical. And again, for those of you that are saying, Nick, I'm not on Twitter, I don't care, I got rid of it a long time ago. Yes, you do care. And the reason why you care is because whenever you have a social media platform that is this powerful and influential and has the ability to make this much money, you do want it to be operated as fairly and openly as possible. Because again, even if it's not affecting you directly as a Twitter user or non-user, it is potentially affecting other decisions that impact your life or your children's life, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a positive development. And again, the two things that we need to look for is what sort of changes are made to Twitter. And do those changes not only increase the amount of people that are able to participate, but does it increase the profits for Twitter? Because that's also a very good indication to the rest, to not just the social media industry, but to the industry as a whole, right? Several industries. Because right now there's this popular narrative among woke capital, which is to say that you got to run as far as you can to the left, especially on some certain issues, in order to not alienate your customer base. Well, if Elon Musk comes in, starts changing rules, and not only is Twitter more open, but it's more profitable, this sends an important message to all those other companies that you do continue to do business with or are essentially forced to do business with because you don't really have alternatives. That no, alienating half of your customer base is kind of a stupid idea. Right. So that's why this is important on so many levels. And I don't see enough people talking about it from that angle. All right. So let's all kind of sit back and see what happens with that. Because I think this is going to be really interesting to watch. Not to mention the fact that now that, ostensibly somebody that is a free speech advocate owns nearly 10% of Twitter. If he finds more people, plus if more conservatives get out there and buy stocks and kind of follow suit, now you actually have a block of people that want to see changes at Twitter that can affect those changes. So again, this is going to be something that's really interesting to watch over the next several, weeks and months. Let's move on to what was happening within the Supreme Court, because there was an interesting statement that was made. I'm going to read this off for you. And it had to do with the whole concept of natural rights. Because natural rights is a concept that is it is read in to our Constitution. Or excuse me, it's specifically read into our Declaration of Independence. That's a better way to put it. It's read into the Declaration of Independence, which informed the creation of the Constitution. There's a lot of people like to act like, well, one is a document that articulates the reasons why the colonies are separating from England, whereas the Constitution is actually a legal document setting up the federal government and the interplay between the federal government and the states. And so, a lot of times people say, well, the Declaration of Independence doesn't matter with respect to interpreting the Constitution. I actually don't think that's true in a moral or philosophical sense. I think it's really important to understand that the Declaration of Independence was critical with respect to the underlying philosophy which informed the creation of the Constitution. And one of the things that they talk about in the Declaration of Independence is this idea of God-given or natural rights. It's the idea that there are some rights which precede government, and government has an obligation to recognize and protect those rights, right? And also has an obligation to not infringe upon them. So it's important to understand that when we're talking about the Bill of Rights, or when we're talking about certain concepts about individual liberty or personal responsibility, which have kind of been enshrined in the American political tradition, right? They haven't always been perfectly executed or observed, but they've been enshrined. It's important to make that distinction that our government was founded on the concepts that there are certain rights that, again, precede government, and the government has an obligation to acknowledge and protect them. So there was a question that was asked of Justice Jackson, who's, again, currently sitting there, it looks like probably going to be confirmed as our next Supreme Court justice. And she said, I do not hold a position on whether individuals possess natural rights. Here is why that is so substantive. A lot of you people are going to like, yeah, Nick, I get why it's so substantive. Okay, but let's really dig into this. If you don't believe that an individual possesses, or you hold no position on whether or not an individual possesses natural rights, the follow-up question I would have liked to have seen has been, where do rights then come from? Because if they're not natural, or if they're not God-given, right? Because someone like me would say, no, they're God-given. They're part of God's created order. Somebody else might say, well, I don't necessarily know if they come from God, but I do believe that they're inherent with respect to existence. Okay? Those positions automatically imply a limitation on government power. There is a third position, and that is that rights are derived from political society, or to say that government is the one that conveys rights. Here's the problem. If that's true, then any sort of right that the government could convey, the government then has the legal authority to take away. And at that point, you really get into this question, are they rights or are they privileges? Because if they're just privileges, well, then they exist because the government says they exist. And they stop existing when the government decides they stop existing. And this has huge ramifications. Because now, not only, we already have a legal process whereby the Constitution can be changed and whereby the government can decide to no longer recognize a particular right or a particular practice, right? We have a constitutional process for that. But ultimately, the reason why so many of these rights surrounding the First Amendment or your Second Amendment rights, the reason why so many of these have stood the test of time is because we've appealed to this idea, and because generally speaking, our legal system and our political philosophy has been rooted in this idea that it doesn't matter how many votes you have in Congress, you don't get to control the thoughts or religious expression of another human being, provided they're not infringing on the rights of somebody else. Right? That has been core. That has been inherent. And what's fascinating is the people that will come back and challenge us on that. The people on the left that will come back like, oh, you say it's inherent, but it didn't apply to African Americans. You say it's inherent, but it didn't apply to women. Okay. But what arguments did people like Frederick Douglass or Susan B. Anthony or all of our other civil rights advocates, what arguments did they use when they were trying to enshrine those rights within our legal codes? They came back and they said, no, it is morally reprehensible to deny equal rights or equal justice before the law to people based off of their skin color or based off of their gender. Really? Why? Because if this is all a question of the government deciding what is a right and what is not a right, and the primary way that you want to determine the way government decides that is through democracy, then what you're saying is that whatever the majority decides on is your right. Whatever the majority decides is just. But that's not what these civil rights advocates were doing. And this is a very important point, and we distinguish this because a lot of conservatives come back and they'll look at the left and be like, well, that's ridiculous. No, what we should be doing is looking at the left and going, really? Because that's not how you argued before. That's not how the civil rights movement was arguing, which, by the way, was not the left in the common sense that we hear today. But civil rights advocates, when they were talking about why we needed to expand the rights enshrined in our Constitution to everybody, was because of the inherent nature of those rights. It was the idea that the government is doing something wrong because it's restricting those rights. Well, why? Because if this is a Supreme Court justice essentially saying that this isn't about, she doesn't have a position on whether or not an individual possesses a natural right, well then, what authority are you appealing to when you say it is wrong that one person has a right that another person does not? Is it just your personal opinion? Okay, great. Why is your personal opinion any better? But that's the crazy part, right? They'll say that this is about democracy. They'll say this is about fairness. When you start talking about fairness, when you start talking about equality or a moral component to that, you are appealing to metaphysics. You're appealing to some sort of authority outside of what men and women can dictate through the law. You're saying that there is a higher moral order that we should appeal to. And guess what? I agree. But if you're going to have a Supreme Court justice say that I don't acknowledge that or I don't take a position on that, well, that's going to be critical with respect to the way that she actually interprets the application of the law. Because now when the government comes in and does something, her argument's going to be like, well, if the government decided it, I guess the government decides it. There's nothing else that we appeal to. And what's so interesting about that is that what this reminds me of, and I always hesitate to bring this up as a point, but I think it actually applies here because I'm not trying to be hyperbolic. But when they were actually having the trials after World War II with respect to Nazi war criminals, one of the most common arguments that the people that executed that used was this idea that I was simply following the laws of the land. I was executing the laws which took place within my country and which govern my country's actions. So how can I be guilty of a criminal act? And there was a lawyer that got up and says that, yes, but is there not a higher law? Well, if we can't appeal to this idea that individuals do have natural rights, then the question is, okay, what is the highest law? Is it the national law? Is it the Constitution? Is it some sort of international law? How does that work? So no, this is a critical point. And this is something that, right now, Lisa Murkowski and Mitt Romney have already said that they're going to vote for. And I'm looking at this going, are you kidding me? I mean, maybe you're not as concerned with respect to some of the decisions she held down that kind of went lenient on people that possess child pornography. Maybe you're not concerned with the fact that one minute she says, I have nothing to do with CRT, and the next minute you go and you find out that she does. Maybe you don't have any problems with that. You should have a problem with a justice that says, I don't have a position on whether or not individuals have natural rights. Because that will impact every single decision. And it is, on some level, a major departure with respect to the way Americans look at what their rights are and the government's role with respect to observing and protecting them as opposed to arbitrarily creating or eliminating them. And we need to remind some of the people now that don't have any problem with this statement that they're probably going to change their tune pretty quick when they find out that that's what they've been appealing to with respect to every civil rights march they've ever participated in, is the idea that human beings have inherent worth and as such have certain unalienable rights. But if those rights are not natural, if those rights are purely a question of what the majority says through government, I got news for you. You might not like what the government does. You might like what the government does, but you don't get to hold it any sort of moral account if there is no objective moral standard which we're appealing to. If this is just about might makes right, as long as it's democratic. I got bad news. There's a lot of dark pages in U.S. history that had a majority vote that didn't make him justified. So to those on the left, they better be real careful on what they appeal or what they celebrate here, because this has massive implications for a lot of things they claim to care about.